Perspective is one of those things where we can watch tutorials, we can look at the little schematic diagrams, and yet somehow to go from this to looking at an actual subject, it's like, I still don't feel that this has helped me to know where to go with here. So in this video, I want to look at a few subjects, number of photo references, and see how do we understand what we know about perspective from looking at it in tutorials to what we actually see in photo references. Let's have a look. There are three main things I always like to establish whenever I look at a scene regarding perspective. The first is eye level. It's important to know where eye level is because this is the spot where we're going to get a horizontal line across our picture. And in this picture, roughly, it's here. Now, eye level is literally that. It's the level of the eye of the person looking at the scene or of where the camera was that took the picture. Now, I was in a hotel room leaning out, looking out up the Paris street. And so eye level is the same height above the ground that our unit was on this side. And we can see here, the important thing about eye level to notice and to always remember is that above eye level, the perspective angle becomes greater and greater and greater. And below eye level, the perspective angle becomes greater and greater and greater, but in the other direction. Now here we have quite a lot of buildings on the street and they're all lined up, they're all in a straight row, and so they all follow the same perspective. And the other thing I like to do is I like to establish the main upper perspective line, which we'll say that one, and then the main lower perspective line, that will be the street level in this case, or we could have used the gutter in the street. And as we know, the perspective lines meet on the eye level, and we call that the vanishing point. In fact, there is a higher one, and that's up here. Now, it's important just to note how extreme the upper and lower lines are, because we want to get them correct. We don't want to make them less. A common fault is to not let them be as extreme as they are. And then we want to make sure that every line in between is in order. Every line in between becomes slightly higher or lower than the one above it, depending what it needs to do. Another point with perspective to notice is that with these buildings further along the street, they don't follow the same perspective lines as these ones because the street curves, and because of that curve, they now get new vanishing points and perspective lines. Not that we have to work all that out, but it's good to be aware that these lines now don't relate to the lines that we've seen. See, they're not in the same pattern as all the ones down here, not in the same perspective scheme. Now, the other thing I like to just get a good look on at the start is foreshortening. Now, foreshortening is the word used to describe the fact that as an object moves further away from us, the visual effect is of compression. In other words, everything seems to get narrower and narrower as the object moves away. So it can be most obviously seen if we look at a particular object. So if we look at this building here in the center, we can see that the center line, which is between the windows, goes here. And yet clearly, this distance is much wider than this distance to look at. And this is the compression. The effect of foreshortening compresses, narrows the second half of that wall, because the second half of the wall is further away than the first half of the wall. And that works with all these buildings. It means that if there were a building next to this that was the same width, it would be a lot narrower than this building, and so forth. So everything compresses. The windows compresses, the spaces between the windows compress. So it's important to be aware of that. It can also, in a view such as this, it's also important to be aware of the fact that the amount of window that we see changes as our view changes. I have a video on this in drawing complex perspective, but we can see here that in this window here, we can see fully half the window and a good amount of the half next to it. Whereas by the time we get just to 2 windows away, we've lost being able to see that. And that's not foreshortening. That's because our actual view of that window changes and more of the window is blocked by the actual thickness of the building. Okay, so I like to look at those things. The final comment in this drawing, this photo, is foreshortening when we're up high. It works downwards too, and this figure is foreshortened. So the lower half of his body is more compressed than the upper half. And if we want to get that right, we've got to watch our proportions and make sure that we proportionally draw the legs shorter than the body. Okay, so that's our first example. Secondly, now we go to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a lovely town on the outskirts of Paris, a former home of French royalty. So, where is eye level? Well, eye level is a bit easier here because there are all these people and I'm standing, as I take this photo, on level ground with them. So eye level is where all of our eyes are, which is here, about here. Now, the important thing to note is that with eye level, if the ground is flat, and particularly in a street scene, if you can see a long distance into the background, is that all the heads of all the people, regardless of how close or far away they are all roughly equal. There's a slight variation because people are different heights, but roughly all in the same place. These people's heads are lower because they're actually sitting down, so the same rule doesn't apply if they're not standing up. And I'm standing, so my eye level is the same as their eye level. And if there was someone walking really close, then their head would take up this enormous amount of the photo because it would be level with all the other heads. So that's the first thing to note, how the perspective impacts the people in this. So again, with the eye level here, on the left-hand side, I'm looking at where the perspective lines are, and that's pretty much the steepest one. And then below the eye level, the lines are not as steep because the eye level's low down. And it's the same on the right-hand side. But the important thing with the right-hand side to note is that these 3 buildings here are not in a straight line. At a glance, we might think they were, but when we look carefully, we can actually see that this street is curving around away from us. And because it's curving around, each of these buildings moves further back away from us as the angle increases, and that changes the foreshortening and it changes the perspective. So in this first building, we can see the perspective line is here. And if we go to the third building, we can see the perspective line follows a totally different pattern. Now, for that vanishing point, all the perspective lines on that building line up just as they do on this building. But the point to realize is each of these 3 buildings has a different vanishing point. And if we were just to sort of do them all the same, then the effect would be to make them all appear in a straight line. And we'd lose this lovely sense of this slight gentle curve moving away from us. And they're the sorts of qualities of a scene we really want to capture. So we don't want to lose that. The other thing that as the buildings curve away, the foreshortening becomes greater. And particularly you can see in this last building, for instance, how the windows are extremely narrow. In fact, you can't see any depth to the windows, just the wall thickness. And they're almost just a series of straight lines compared to here, where we can actually see gaps between and we can see some of the rails and so forth. So we need to treat each building quite separately. Okay, so a lot of good observations there. And of course, in the background, we can see that these buildings also follow different perspective patterns. And as they move away, again, there's foreshortening along the building as it moves along. Okay, let's look at the next one. Sometimes eye level is not so obvious as in this scene. If we look carefully, particularly using the lines on the side of this building, we can work out readily enough that eye level is here, which looks a bit high when we look at where all the people's heads are who are in the scene. But it's because I was actually standing on something when I took this. So those sorts of things we need to watch out for. Now, this building has very strong perspective lines that we can see. And again, they all meet at the vanishing point on the horizon, on eye level, which in this instance is well within our paper. Now, the important thing to pay attention to is when we have perspective lines that get higher and higher, particularly when they don't go very far, when they're not very long, such as on a tower, is that it can be tempting, and I often see this, people draw them as if they're parallel to the last long perspective line. But in fact, the angle should keep changing as it gets higher. And if we don't do that, we lose the dramatic effect of those steep angles. We lose what I like to call the visual drama. So it's important that we keep those angles getting higher and higher as they go up. In this scene as well, it's actually a 2-point perspective because we have a perspective line going off to the left to a vanishing point, which is way off the paper on the left-hand side. It's not as severe as on the right-hand side, but I think it adds to the interest to draw it. And it does get higher. It does get more obvious as it gets higher and higher. Now, it's also important to realize that the perspective works with things that aren't just buildings. And in this case, we have a number of things. We have a row of lampposts on both sides of the street. So on the right-hand side of the street, if we join up the tops of the lampposts, it's a very steep perspective line. And we want to make sure that we line them up in this way. There's also, even though the lampposts are equally spaced, the foreshortening means that they rapidly get closer and closer together. So that's also something to pay attention to. On the other side of the road, again, we can line up the tops of the lampposts, and they follow the same perspective line as pretty much the lines on the building, except that the final one protrudes past the corner of the building. So it's important to note those. Another important subject for perspective is rows of parked cars where we're looking along the row. Foreshortening means that the actual width of the car compresses more and more as we look up along the street. And in the end, if we can go far enough up the street, we really can't see any of the sides of the car. They really become a series of sort of rounded vertical lines. And it's important not to try and draw a car, because then we won't get the foreshortening correct. We just have to look at the patterns of lines and draw those. And even though this is flat ground, we can see that the heads aren't in a straight line, but they actually move up slightly higher and higher. And that's because I was standing up off the ground level. So I'm actually higher than all these heads looking down. And that's enough to change that rule that says all the heads are on the same level. So it is important to actually observe what is here when we're drawing. Okay. This is a concert hall in Berlin. Now, eye level is not so obvious here, but having taken the photo, I know that eye level is up here somewhere, because in fact, this church with a tall tower here has an very similar one on the other side of the square, on the other side of the concert hall, and I was at the top of that tower. So I know I was up here. And so, in fact, all of the lines are below eye level. And if we are to get a sense of where the vanishing point would be for all these lines going off to the right, we can see that the vanishing point is going to be way, not just off the paper, but actually off the table. And so it's a very long, dramatic line. In fact, we also have vanishing points, very dramatic vanishing points off to the left as well. And we actually see them in the patterning on the square ground as well. But here we can see them. That one's going to be on the page, but creates a very dramatic effect with these two vanishing points with these great lines going off to them. So it's important to really capture the extreme angles in our drawing because they create a great sense of visual drama. Now this is also a scene, as is often the case with high scenes looking down, where the vertical perspective is important too. And so the equivalent in vertical perspective at eye level is the vertical line, which is pretty much directly in front of the person taking the photo, which for me was about here. And it's the same principle as with horizontal eye levels. On each side of the vertical line, the angle increases as it moves further away. So as it moves to one side, the angle increases. As it goes the other way, the angle increases. So let's just have a look. So we see here with that actual corner of the building, now we can see that these two lines would meet if they kept going. If we come across to this line, we can see that again this line's going to come and meet. And if we go across to one of the further lines on this building, which is the line of the furthest column on the portico, we again can see that all these lines would meet well off the page down at the bottom. But between each extreme and the vertical line, the perspective slowly gets straighter and straighter and straighter. And so again, it's important with our lines to capture that. The other really important thing in this scene is the foreshortening. And if we look, say, at these windows along the top, we can see that if we compare the first and the last, we can see that the last one looks just a millimetre wide, whereas this one looks 4 or 5 millimetres wide. So they get narrower and closer together as they slide along there. The other thing to notice that I find helpful in working out foreshortening is to find that midpoint. So I look at this and I go, okay, there's 12 windows here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so that's actually the halfway point there. And yet from there to there is a lot longer. And so it helps me just appreciate the foreshortening and how much I have to compress what I see as the building moves further away. The other place where foreshortening is really important is just positioning the top of pediments such as this. So we know that if we were at the ground looking up, this pediment point is halfway along this facade, and yet, and we can see that is in fact the case. But if we look at, from here to here, this half of the pediment is a much larger triangle than that half. So these are the things we need to pay attention to. And of course, with our perspective lines, the tops of these, the heads of these two statues follow the perspective lines off to the vanishing point on the right. Okay, so while there's a lot of perspective complexity in this, it's the same principles that we've had with everything else, and it adds up to a really interesting subject, and I'm thinking I need to draw this myself. Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. Perspective is one of those things where we can know the theory, we can have watched lots of perspective tutorials on YouTube, but it can still be a bit tricky when we're looking at actual subjects to draw to connect those studies with the subject that we're going to draw. So I hope going through this exercise with a number of examples was a helpful thing to do, because the more easily we can see how those principles of perspective work in our actual subject, the more easily we'll be able to draw that subject accurately. Because whatever we can see, we have a chance to draw. And if we don't see it clearly, it's that much harder to draw it accurately. So anyway, hope all that was very helpful. The most important thing, of course, with your drawing is to have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.